A few weeks back we actually got a ton of snow, and of course I had to use this opportunity to get some snowy landscape shots. I couldn't even wait for the snowstorm to stop. I decided to try my luck right away. As several roads were closed, my landscape radius was rather limited, but I had a rough plan. Thick clouds and heavy snowfall were responsible for some rather uninteresting light, but my goal wasn't to capture a vibrant golden hour scene anyway. There is a small hill with a few trees on top close by. What I want to do with this scenery is to create a minimalistic landscape photo with the snow-covered hill, the tree on top, and some darker clouds in the background. For this picture, the tree will be the main subject. However, to get a pleasing result, you can't just take any tree. There are a few criteria which need to be fulfilled. As I want to create a minimalistic landscape shot, I want to reduce the visible elements to a minimum: tree, hill and clouds. This means I first have to look for the right perspective. Depending on the angle and height I'm holding the camera, this scene has way more elements than I want to include. We can get rid of all of them by finding the right perspective. I want the camera to be a little lower so the trees behind the hill disappear. To remove the tree branches on the right side, I simply need to point the camera more towards the other direction. I just need to walk a few more meters to be able to get a clean shot. Now for the camera settings. I want to get a little closer to the tree, and this means I'm using a telelens to get this effect. I already guessed I will need the telelens, so I attached it at home to not have to change the lenses during the snowstorm. I also played around with different shutter speeds to increase or reduce the motion blur of the falling snowflakes. I ended up with this image. I think I achieved the minimalistic look, but I wasn't really satisfied with it. So the next morning I decided to go back there and shoot the sunrise from the same spot, and ended up with this. The warm clouds in the back nicely separate the landscape from the sky. To keep the image as minimalistic as possible, I shot a long exposure of 30 seconds to make the clouds smoother, and we even got a bit of sun shining through them. Let's take a look at the editing process. So here we are in the Camera Raw editor of Photoshop, and the first thing I want to do is to change the profile from Adobe Color to Adobe Standard to lessen the contrast slightly. Looking at this image, it looks quite good already, and I don't think there's much left to do. I still want to adjust the exposure overall a little bit, so let's start in the Lights tab. What I want to do is to make this image brighter by bringing up the exposure, and at the same time, since this obviously also affects the highlights, which I don't actually want, I'm going to bring down the highlights and try to get some more details out of the clouds in the back. For the same effect, I want to bring down the whites. Just right about here looks fine to me. And then I want to slightly raise the shadows, giving this image a softer look by doing this, which I think works quite well for this scene. That's pretty much it for the exposure adjustments. Let's take a look at the color tab. Here I just want to play around with the white balance a little bit. This shot could use a little more warmth, so let's bring up the temperature a notch. And I think that's it already. And I also want to go through the Effects tab, giving this image some more texture. This helps making smaller details like those small tree branches a little sharper. At the same time, I'm going to bring down the clarity, which overall introduces a softer look to the image. And for the same effect, I'm going to bring down the dehaze slightly, just like that. Wonderful. At this point, we also want to apply a little bit of masking, so let's go through the masks real quick. I want to start with a linear gradient for the foreground, covering only a tiny portion of the very near foreground. Here I want to bring down the exposure slightly, creating some kind of vignetting effect. And I also want to go down into the effects tab and bring up the clarity to add structure to the snow. Then let's create another linear gradient for the top part. Again, I want to create some kind of vignetting effect, and I'm doing this by simply bringing down the exposure. This works quite well on these clouds above the tree, and I do think the top part of the sky could be colder, so I'm going to slightly drop the temperature, introducing some more blue tones up here, and that's it. Then what I want to do next is to add some more brightness to the horizon level of this image, just above the landscape. For this, I'm going to create a simple sky selection. And since I don't want to target the whole sky, I'm going to say subtract, choose a linear gradient, and I'm going to subtract pretty much most of the sky like this. And with this mask, all I need to do now is to bring up the exposure and thus just make the horizon a little brighter. We can even introduce some more temperature, giving this part some more warmth. I think this looks great. Next up, I do want to work on this part of the landscape in the foreground. So I'm starting using a radial gradient, just trying to get a rough selection like this. And now I'm going to say subtract and choose sky. And I also don't want to affect the tree, so I'm going to say subtract radial gradient, and I'm going to just roughly cover this tree. So in here, I want to bring up the exposure, giving the landscape just a tad more brightness. And finally, let's create one more linear gradient for the top part of the image. And again, bring down the exposure for that very heavy vignetting effect. Again, we can drop the temperature to introduce some more coldness up there in the sky. But that looks great. So that's the image after the masking adjustments. This was the image before the masking adjustment. So you can see, again, we have quite a transformation making use of local adjustments. So next up, let's also do a little bit of color grading, and I'm going to start in the color mixer. Here I just want to boost the saturation of a few specific color tones, and that's orange and yellow. Obviously, this will mostly affect the sky, making it more vibrant. At the same time, I think we can bring down the blue saturation just a bit, so the snow doesn't look too bluish. Then we can do some split toning as well. I just want to target the highlights, because with the highlights I can affect the sky in a very nice way. So we're going to set up the hue to something warm and just bring up the saturation a bit. Here I think it's important to really not push the saturation too much, otherwise it quickly looks way too unnatural. So I want to use a rather low amount of saturation here, and by doing this just keep the foreground more natural. Now the final color grading step is happening in the calibration tab. Here I just want to bring down the blue primary hue, and this will have a very nice effect on the warm color tones of the sky, but also will change the blue tones and turn them into more of an aqua color tone. So be very, very careful here. And finally, let's bring up the saturation, and that's it. Now all that's left to do in the raw editor is the sharpening. So let's go into the details tab, bring down the radius, increase the details, add a bit of masking, and then bring up the amount of sharpening. And we are done editing this image. I actually think I need to crop this a little bit, just like this. And now let's open this up in Photoshop. What I want to do first in Photoshop is to clean up this image. So I'm duplicating that layer by hitting Ctrl J to have a backup. Then I'm using the spot healing brush, and I want to zoom in and get rid of all the sensor spots first. Okay, that looks much better. Now there are a few footsteps, which is because of me, as I was walking right through the frame the day before. So I don't think they look nice in this image, so I'm using the remove tool, and I'm just going to paint over them to get rid of them. Alright. And finally, there are a few little tree branches in the back which I want to remove using the spot healing brush again. Perfect. Now there only are 2 tiny adjustments I want to do on this image to finish it, and that's first to create a photo filter adjustment layer. This will add some very nice warmth effect on top. However, I only want to affect the sky, so I'm going to get rid of this layer mask, choose the layer right below it, go to select and choose sky. With the sky selection active, I'm going back to the adjustment layer and hit the layer mask icon. This way, only the sky is affected by this warmth effect. However, I'm not done with that layer mask. I'm going to use the gradient tool by pressing G. And you see it's going from black to transparent, and I'm going to use that to get rid of the top of this adjustment layer. So only really this area of the sky is affected by this warmth effect. Okay, we could maybe increase the density of that photo filter adjustment layer to make it stronger. But what we can do as well is to grab another adjustment layer. This time let's choose Vibrance and copy the layer mask by holding down the Alt key and dragging it on top of the Vibrance adjustment layer. Click yes. And then I'm just going to bring up the Vibrance to boost the warmer color tones in here. And that's it. So I hope this whole video was interesting. If you have any questions left, feel free to ask in the comments. And thank you so much for watching this video.